Exit. During the summer of 2014, I was in a rough spot. I'd stopped going to a part-time job I hated, stopped attending a vocational training course that I hated, and stopped talking to most of my friends. I'd retreated to my parents' house under the auspices of looking for work back home, but for nearly 3 months I didn't look for much of anything. I just kept to myself, sat in front of a monitor through the long hours of the night, and drank whatever my meager savings could buy me. It's difficult putting into words what exactly was going on in my head. I have a friend that calls that stint of time radio silence. The few times I've tried to describe the things I was thinking over to him, I've failed to get across just how keenly I felt like a piece of waste circling a drain back then. It's like trying to describe a house or room whose vague impressions you recall from childhood to an adult who's never seen the sights. Like trying to illustrate echoes for the deaf. Still, I will try to describe it here one more time. If I'm going to tell what happened to me that August, I feel it's important to understand where my head was beforehand. I'm not even certain what I experienced was real, so understanding the bleak headspace I occupied gives a little more context for the story I'm about to tell. I don't know exactly what started me down the path to abject depression, if that's the description to give the sensation, but I do know when I became aware of it. It seems almost stupid now, small and frivolous. I suppose it was. In my early 20s, I used to listen to the sort of mid-wit talk shows and podcasts that give people with too much time on their hands and enough cleverness to realize it, the false yet comforting impression that they're having conversations worth having. A smooth-talking friend in the ear to keep your thoughts from crowding in on you when it's quiet at night and you feel most alone. I recall an interview with some smug, deracinated coastal comedian whose name I've desperately endeavored to forget, veering on to the topic of nostalgia. I listened to it on a nighttime walk back from a corner store where I picked up my cigarettes. It was late spring, the cusp of the summer heat haunting Louisville's aging streets. I remember the flow of it like I heard it yesterday, though I've avoided the whole show like the plague ever since. To compress it, the comedian believed that the sensation of fond nostalgia was like a drug, and that the comfort which accompanied nostalgia was a sort of chain holding back personal or societal progress. That one couldn't, in other words, develop without abandoning, or at least disparaging, the past. I don't know precisely why that pulled me from the sights and smells of the night walk, but it did. It smacked me across the mouth and set me to wandering around in silence for almost an hour. I wasn't exactly someone who lived only for childhood memories or spent every waking hour delving into history for ideals to admire, but for whatever reason that recorded conversation made me angry. I couldn't reply to this remote, pre-recorded man, of course, and even if I could, it'd serve no purpose. A soul that disconnected from reality cannot be reconnected. I was a stubborn person with little to worry about but ample time and energy to waste worrying, though, and I dwelt on it. How utterly removed from the world around them must someone be, despite memory? Every word I write had a root thousands of years ago, and only memory passed those down. Every institution which ensures proverbial Mongol raiders don't pour over the horizon and scorch the season's crops was laid down long before any of us drew breath. To be so venomous towards the idea of fond memories, personal or cultural, was akin to a flower ripping up its roots on the grounds that it couldn't trust what they looked like beneath the earth. An inconsequential clown's opinion should have been, as I've said, a small and frivolous thing. After all, what bearing did a sneering urbanite entertainer have on the day-to-day anguishes or triumphs which all of us rolling around down here in the dirt bump up against every day? But that didn't matter. That little 10-minute recorded conversation had gotten my mind started down a dangerous track. That taste of unadulterated nihilism made me acutely aware of just how directionless and aimless my life had become. With no goals and no direction, what was there to differentiate me, a 20-something nobody, from someone as hopeless as him? I didn't have a solid answer to that yet. I was too young to settle upon a path for my life to follow, and there was little motivation to try until something stuck. I was in a rut, you see, and though I didn't know how I'd solve it, I was devoted to trying. It was during that late summer period of soul-searching that I decided to take a little road trip to the Badlands. Years ago, my family had taken a rushed, touristy jaunt out to Montana and Wyoming to tool through some of the national parks. In the process, we'd driven past long stretches of the Badlands of South Dakota, and frankly, the wide expanses and toothy pillars of the windswept plains and jagged plateaus had thrilled me far more than the pine-scented forests of the Rocky Mountains. The landscape had felt like the surface of an alien world, and with my mind in so dire a spot, I figured the clean air and tender quiet of a cheap camping trip would clear my head. I drove up to Badlands National Park in one go through the night, and after picking up a parking pass and catching a few hours of sleep in a gravel lot alongside the trailhead, I woke in my car seat just in time to witness the sun rising over the arid grassland, painting the cloudless sky orange. The pillars and plateaus cast mighty shadows over the wavering plains, and the pale grass danced in the wind as if it were a legion of living things marching off towards distant horizons. Small pools and creek beds glittered in the newborn dawn, and birds cast shadows as they soared overhead, scanning their rolling dominion. The next 5 days were nothing short of heavenly. I wove about the park day and night, scaling slopes and jogging the trails in the light, and gazing for the stars after the fall of darkness. The moon was just shy of being full, and it lit the rolling hills and craggy stone in a soft blue glow that made the landscape even more enthralling. The park was all but empty, and save for meeting a few wandering hikers during the day, I spent the whole of my time there in silence. My worries seemed far away, and the quiet nights lent me the breathing room I needed to set those worries aside and wonder about the future. When it came time to pack up and head for home, I was reluctant to go. I spent the last day making a long 16-mile off-trail hike back towards where I'd left the car, and took my sweet time getting there. I wanted to watch one last sunset amongst the rock formations, and only after the fiery skyscape had faded to the cool blue of night did I finally finish my walk to the parking lot and pile into my battered old Camry. My legs were aflame with the days of exertion, and I probably stunk to high heaven. But my head was clear, and for the first time in a long time, I felt I had a bit of hope for the future. I began the long trip home that night, thinking to drive right through and pass out the moment I reached Louisville. It's hard to say exactly when the strangeness began. After all, I'd been alone all through the afternoon, and I hadn't seen a living soul in many hours. But I don't think I was experiencing anything weird at the park. I never felt disturbed or watched out there, nor did I think there was any reason to hurry. Those feelings only crept up on me much later, after miles and miles whiled away on the dark and barren state highways of South Dakota. I was nearing I-90 when I began to dwell on the fact that I hadn't passed a single car on the highways leading up to that point. I shook the thought away, of course. It was about midnight, after all, and the roads all wound through miles of open pasturage and sparsely populated little towns. It was only right there'd be no one out and about at this hour. Those consolations went out the window once I was on the interstate, blazing towards Iowa. The fourth hour was passed in abject darkness and isolation on I-90. I didn't even see state troopers parked out on the median to keep an eye on late-night traffic. There were no stalled vehicles alongside the road, nor were there distant lights of farmhouses or wind farms visible along the horizon. The low-rolling landscape was devoid of life. I've thought many times that all this nothingness should have scared me much sooner than it did, but the human mind has many methods of salving its worries. I figured I just hadn't registered the open emptiness of this stretch of road on the way out here. I'd been tired and nearing the end of my journey then, after all. Perhaps some kind of power outage had quashed the lights, and the country around me was even darker than it had been during that first drive. Whatever the case might be, I swallowed my nerves and reached the Iowa border without further fretting, letting the audio rendition of Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian I was playing over the speakers sweep me away as I drove. The audiobook was a good distraction, perhaps too good. I swung into a rest area just past the state line, and I immediately knew something was off. The gleam of the roadside signs led me in, but I fast found that the little pavilions and welcome center were dark and still. There were no trucks in the large semi-parking lanes, and the lot was void of any other cars. I rolled to a stop before the welcome center, turned off the car, and stepped out into the calm, cool, windless night. I listened and heard nothing. I scanned the surrounding fields and saw nothing. I leaned back into my car and took up my phone, thinking to check whether I'd missed some emergency alert or freak weather event in the area. Clear as the starry sky was, I felt there had to be some tangible reason for all this, whatever this was. It was the first time I'd bothered to shift off the audiobook during the drive, and I quickly discovered I had no signal. No messages, no alerts, no warnings. Just silent, plastic, cold isolation. I tried to keep my wits about me. I walked along the little path up to the welcome center and went to open the bathroom door set into the side of the building. But the grungy tiled hall within was pitch dark, and the shadow seemed almost dangerous next to the soft blue light of the moonlit grounds outside. I told myself I could use my phone to navigate the little bathroom, tried to convince myself during the silent moments spent hesitating on the brink that I shouldn't stoop to pissing outside at a rest stop. I couldn't shake the nervous tension which had taken hold of me, though, and I ended up using the bushes beside the vending machines, glancing around like a guilty criminal all the while. No new cars rolled into the lot, though, nor did any distant sounds of passing planes or rolling traffic reach my ears. I was alone. And yet, somehow, I did not feel alone. In my childhood, I'd often cut across neighborhood yards when trying to weave my way back home at night, partly to speed up the trip back and partly due to the tense atmosphere which arose from being somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. I felt exactly the same tension here, and much as I tried, I could not make myself understand why. This was a public installation on a public interstate, and yet I could not shake the desire to crouch and reduce my silhouette when I crossed the open walkway towards the lot. I stuck close to the hedges and inactive lampposts around the empty parking spaces while I trotted for the car, overcome by the desire to move, to get myself out of there. It was only when I slid into the driver's seat and the door was locked behind me that a bit of desperate calm washed over me, and I looked around once more, trying to find a reason for my inexplicable unease. Again, nothing. Not one sight astray save the emptiness and the inactive lights. I started the car, suddenly conscious of how loud the noise must be in the silent openness which rolled outward around me. I flipped on the headlights and quickly headed up the lot towards the ramp back onto I-90, speeding along the curving track through the sparse trees surrounding the rest area. I was almost back to the open road when I saw it, and the sighting was so quick that, in the moment, I didn't believe I'd seen anything at all. There was a bright green reflective sign beside the I-90 on-ramp giving the mileage to cities down the road in Iowa. It was nestled in a lone outcrop of scraggly little scrub pines, which had grown up to obscure the base, untended by the rest area's maintenance crews. As my headlights glinted off the sign and I made note of the distances, I had an impression that something tall and dark was leaning down over the sign. Something big, I reasoned, for the sign itself must have been 10 or 12 feet tall at its peak. In the scant seconds between seeing the shape behind the sign and passing it by, I fancied I could make out a rounded head atop a willowy body, a thin limb bracing the dark shape against the comparative neon of the colorful sign. I thought several tapering shapes, fingers perhaps, sprouted off from that limb, gripping the edge of the sign, black against the brightness. Whatever it was, I was past it so quickly I had no time to truly register it. It was only in the silent hour on the dark roadway which followed that my memory seemed fettered to that outcrop of trees around the sign, and the thing I thought I saw hidden in their midst. It had been darker than the dark of the pine boughs, smooth and totally featureless. It was easy to dismiss it as my own nervous imagination. Branches and fronds could, after all, look like fingers in the dark, couldn't they? These were the sorts of things I told myself to keep the fear at bay as exit after vacant exit drifted by out the windows, and not one was lit by the welcome, civil glow of electricity. Not one gas station or roadside hotel hosted idling cars in the moonlit lots. They stood as eerie midnight silhouettes against the starry horizon, seeming more like moldering ancient stone monuments than corporate consumer architecture. The soaring highway gas price signs were the most uncanny. Giant black squares floating overhead against the purple-blue backdrop of the cloudless heavens. It was the strangeness of these inactive hunks of metal and plastic that gave me my second sighting along the drive, and made my first harder to deny. I only had about a fifth of a tank of gas left, and I was starting to become worried I'd run dry before hitting a span of road where the gas stations were active again. I was glaring out over the open road at each towering gas sign that drifted by, desperate for any sign of life, my stomach churning with the obstinate certainty I wouldn't see any. But I did see something. A flash of shadow and motion on the pole beneath one of the distant gas signs. My eyes free from the empty, arrow-straight road, I watched as a coal-colored figure shambled down the sign's post with a clumsy agility that looked almost comedic. As my eyes traced its path, I realized there was more than one, all bounding and skittering down the smooth metal of the sign towards the trees along the roadside. I sped up, of course, and by the time I'd passed the exit, I was going well over 100 down empty old I-90. I couldn't fully grasp my predicament in those moments. The whole night seemed vague, almost dreamlike. Indeed, during that stretch of the drive, I began to wonder if I'd dozed off in the car. I tried the silly methodologies pitched by would-be lucid dreamers to test whether one is awake, double-checking the writing in my phone's interfaces and reciting old dates and numbers. I did not awaken, nor did my uneasy, slow-boiling panic subside. It was in the grip of that panic, with the taunting needle of my fuel meter hugging the E, that a light came into view in the far distance, off to the roadside. My heart leapt, and I pushed on with a fervor of which I did not know I was capable. I imagine a wanderer freshly escaped from the Sahara would be just as desperate to reach water as I was to reach some small islet of normalcy amidst all this weird, yawning menace. So frantic was I that when the source of the lights came fully into view up an off-ramp, I nearly careened off the road, making the turn towards them. The green sign I saw through the haze of my own delight dubbed the town Farmers. What awaited me up there was a single, lonely BP station, flanked by an equally lonely Comfort Inn. Strangest of all was a weirdly placed used car dealership. All three sat along the same side of the two-lane highway onto which the exit ramp dumped me, and the only one with cars near it was the dealership lot. Still, the light posts and interiors of all three were shining like suns, and I could not buck the need to confirm that I wasn't mad. I needed to see someone, anyone, to ease my tension. Gas took priority. I swung into the lot and popped the gas cap in a screeching whirlwind, then jammed a card into the miraculously working pump. It was only then that I realized the "Begin Fueling" prompt was already displayed on the screen. After a clumsy moment spent fiddling with buttons to no avail, I took up the pump, jammed it in, and was astonished to hear it fueling the moment I depressed the handle. I didn't dally, though. I checked my phone one last time, again finding the signal non-existent. I jogged across the lot and pushed into the lit station interior. I called out, asking empty air if there was anyone in there. I slipped around the corner and stuck my head into the back room, finding both it and the bathrooms equally empty. Then it was back out into the lot, what little calm I'd regained slipping away as quickly as it had come. I scanned the open fields and waiting road and spotted no movement. The pump was still running, and I knew it would be another minute or so before the slow meter filled the tank. The hotel was closest, and it was on wavering legs that I sprinted across a small grassy divider between the two lots and barreled down an empty row of parking spaces towards the entrance. Again I burst through the swinging doors, shouting for help like a madman, and again my scouring of the lobby and the little office behind the desk yielded nothing. It was then I began to feel threatened. There was something wrong here. In a way, it was even worse than the nothingness and the distant dark shadows at the cusp of my vision. Here, I didn't just feel nervous and alone. I felt vulnerable. I turned for the doors again, and that's when I saw them. Across the way, in the light of the BP station, something was leaning over my car. Several somethings, I realized. So tall they had to lean over not to brush against the awning that sheltered the pumps. They were shadows against the bright whites of the columns and lights, and at that distance through the glass doors of the hotel, they seemed to waver and shimmer, like tears in a painting which moved of their own accord. There was a moment's icy fear as I stood there watching, fully registering what had happened. Like a deep-sea fish astride the dark currents of the seafloor, I'd been lured in with lights. As I looked on, yet more of the spindly things strode in from the fields around the station or rose up from amidst the parked cars in the dealership lot to close in on my vehicle. The station was swarming with them, clambering onto the roof and clinging to the sides of columns. Terrible as the sight was, I couldn't look away. I couldn't help but be enthralled by the otherness of them. Vague as they were, I could see they had 2 arms and 2 legs, and moved much like a man, though their movements were strange, and their ability to climb and grasp seemed almost insectile. They were lean to the point of looking frail, and yet their towering dark forms seemed to thrum with a strange energy that bent the air around them like heat haze. They had bulbous heads, eyeless as far as I could see, which made them look for all the world like giant stickmen sprung to life from a comic strip. And yet, there was nothing cartoonish or laughable about them. They were not from here, I thought. They were not meant to be here. Their bodies were not of matter, at least not as I understand it. Perhaps that's the wrong way to frame it. Perhaps I was not meant to be here. Whatever the case, their mere presence made me feel off. I felt like a child who had slipped into a forbidden theater and witnessed unspeakable violence which he'll never be able to unsee. Then, all at once, they froze, every one of them, Their featureless heads made it impossible to tell where they were looking, but I felt the ice-cold certainty they had spotted me. I held still for just a moment, clinging to the hope that they hadn't, but that ended the second they started to run, to bound in 2 long leaps over the open asphalt towards the flimsy doors of the hotel. I stumbled back into the rear of the lobby and sprinted down the hall out of view. My mind leapt from plan to plan, but in the heat of the run I chose to try for the stairs. The sign for the stairway glinted near the end of the hall, a beacon leading me onward. There was a clatter and flash of motion as something bowled furiously into the glass door which ended the hall. Though it was kept at bay, I didn't wager the things outside were too dumb to push their way inside. I wheeled sideways to one of the room doors and tried the knob, and nearly tumbled over as the door gave way and I plunged into a dark room. It was a remarkably usual, cloned hotel room, and I twisted the bolt behind me and felt my way through the gloom into the bathroom next to the entrance. Again I locked the door behind me, and to a distant symphony of shattering glass and thundering sprints along the halls beyond the room, I climbed into the tub and lay low as if the plastic would shield me. For a harried moment I flicked on the screen of my phone just long enough to be certain I was alone in the locked bathroom. Then I plunged myself into darkness and waited. There were thuds overhead on the upper floors and the distant rumble of motion on the roof and outer walls. Some of the footsteps, if that's the best word for them, were slower, halting, pacing, scouring. I controlled my heavy breath, wondering how well the things could hear. I clenched my fists and held still. There was a splintering of metal and thick, sturdy wood, and a scraping as something huge dragged itself into the entryway just beyond the bathroom door. Much as I tried to keep my thoughts elsewhere, I couldn't help but imagine one of the limber giants wriggling on all fours like a caver to fit into the comparatively cramped space, its long limbs grating the carpets and its featureless head scraping plaster from the ceiling. It felt impossibly warm. In the space of several seconds, I'd gone from fairly comfortable to stifled and suffocated, my lungs feeling tepid, as if I were breathing the heady air of a dense jungle. Though heat radiated from the door and the clumsy thumping and shambling continued on, there were no grunts or vocalizations. No breathing or panting gave me the comfort of believing a natural animal was out there beyond the cheap shield of the bathroom door. Gripped by the paralysis of being so close to what had to be death, I didn't even jolt when my phone vibrated against the unforgiving plastic of the tub's lining in my pocket. The noise seemed deafening, so much so that I didn't even fumble to stop it. Whatever was out there, it had already heard. The black comedy timing of the call wasn't lost on me, despite the situation. A perfect time for signal to return, I thought. The sounds outside fell quiet as the second vibration came. So did all of the weird noises. The hotel beyond the room seemed to fade away, and the sole soundtrack to my world was the third buzzing death knell which sounded out beside me. Slowly, almost tenderly, a knock came at the door. Then came the fourth vibration, and with it the end of the nightmare. Or whatever it was. Whether all that time on the vacant roads east from the Badlands was a vision, I cannot say. But when I opened my clenched eyes to the buzzing of my phone, it was on the dashboard of my car rather than stashed away in a pocket. Afternoon sunlight spilled through the windows, burning my eyes, and the muffled sounds of passing traffic spilled in from the bustling lot where I was parked. I looked around as the phone continued to ring and struggled to make any sense of what I saw. I was parked in the lot of a shopping center just across the highway from the neighborhood where my family lived, all the way back in Louisville. It was a place I'd seen 1,000 times and more, and yet, in the context of those confused seconds gaining my bearings, it was as alien to me as the ocean's depths. There was no explaining how I'd gotten from South Dakota to Kentucky. The charges on my card were still there from the trip out, as I'd later find, but I'd lost the better part of a day driving back home through the night and following morning. I've debated what truly happened many times. The intervening years have seen me subject myself to everything from the prodding of psychiatric facilities to the casual speculation of friends and family. I was, as I stated to begin with, going through a relatively confused portion of my life, but I also had felt elated after my trip west, which makes me hesitant to blame my state of mind for what I experienced. Moreover, I've never experienced any sleep strangeness, whether sleepwalking or narcoleptic fits, so to lose so many hours and pin it on my exhaustion seems equally odd. I figure if I'd drifted off at the wheel the night of my departure, I'd have ended up in a ditch rather than in the parking lot of a shopping center all the way back home. But there's something else, something which does even more to keep me from accepting the half-hearted shrugging answers of counselors or friends. That something is the phone call which woke me, if that's actually what happened. I answered a few scatterbrained moments after coming to and gathering my fractured thoughts. What I heard was so odd, so utterly in step with the weird things I'd seen in the dark, that I consigned it to fancy, more for my own sanity than anything else. I've never told anyone, nor have I ever wanted to. That would only court yet more worried stares and knowing proclamations of, "That's weird." I only do so now because I wish to put the events behind me and consign them to paper before trying my best to forget them. As time has dragged on, I've only grown more and more worried that a second call might come. So, with a life to live and more important things to dwell on, I'll record it here as a sort of metaphorical burial. One last testament to a portion of my memory I hope never to revisit again. The voice was female, smooth, calming, measured, poised to the point of seeming robotic, but what it told me was anything but calming. I was thanked for my cooperation, and the speaker apologized for any inconvenience we, and that was exactly the term she used, might have caused. She then said that I could, and I quote, expect to hear back from them in the future. She hoped to foster a good working relationship. Then she hung up.